This is the first lecture from Monday, April 13th. Looking over the learning objectives for this course, we're almost to the end of this. We got into the second to last one where the objective was to understand the flow of energy and materials through ecosystems. So what we're doing is moving on to this topic of ecosystem ecology. We've looked at the ecology of individual organisms. We looked at the ecology of populations. We just got done looking at communities, and that biomes was kind of a transition between community and ecosystem ecology. But now we're on to ecosystems, where we're not looking at individual organisms, but we're looking. The main focus is on the flow of materials from one organism to another, beginning with energy, but we're going to look at nitrogen, carbon, water, those kind of things. So some of those are incorporated into living things. Some of them are in the air, some of them are in water, some of them are in land, soil, sediments. So that's what we're going to turn our attention to now. So we're going to look at two different components of this for the most part. One is energy that we're going to talk about today. Energy is really, really important. Obviously, every living thing needs energy. Without enough energy, then living things run into the problem of not being able to grow, which is a characteristic of all living things, and they have a problem reproducing, which is another characteristic of all living things, reproduction. Maybe not in individuals, but every species has to reproduce or it's going to go extinct. And we've looked at the importance of channeling energy towards reproduction for being a success evolutionarily, or in other words, not being a failure, obtaining genetic immortality. So let's look at this idea of energy. There's different forms of energy, so we're going to look at those. There's different ways that energy moves between organisms and within an organism, different ways that energy moves through communities, and different ways that energy moves through ecosystems. And we're going to see that energy moves differently than nutrients and some of these elements that we're looking at, some of the molecules. Those are cycled, whereas energy is more of a one-way street. So let's look at some of that, some of those differences anyway. Well, as I said, there's different forms of energy. You're probably familiar with this, one of the laws of thermodynamics, that energy can't be created or destroyed. It just changes forms. In living things, there's a number of different forms. On Earth, there's a number of different forms of energy. So to begin with, almost all of the energy, 99-point-something% of the energy that starts out moving through ecosystems comes from the sun. So there's different wavelengths of light that travel 96 million miles from the sun to the earth. A lot of those wavelengths are not used. They don't enter into ecosystems. A lot of it is deflected. Some of it is absorbed in the atmosphere. Some of it is too high wavelength or too low wavelength, and it's not used by living things. But there's certain wavelengths of light, visible light, and the light that's used for photosynthesis that are commonly used by living things. So this sunlight is incorporated into living things by photosynthesis. Photosynthetic organisms can convert light energy to chemical energy. They can basically make sugar. And then things that don't make their own energy, they're not autotrophs, they're not phototrophs, they're not photosynthetic, they eat other things. Those are consumers. And so consumers get their energy from the producers. The consumers die after a while. They produce wastes while they're living. And then those things, dead, decaying organic matter, that contains energy. Wastes contain energy. And that's a source of energy for decomposers. So decomposers, you see in this figure, they're obtaining energy from consumers that have died or that they're feeding on, basically, and from the producers as well. Whatever's dead, laying on the ground, incorporated into the soil that's available for decomposers is a source of energy. And then these decomposers, they keep this nutrients anyway in an ecosystem. They recycle these nutrients. So if you look at these two colored arrows in this figure, this is the fundamental difference between energy and the way that it moves through ecosystems and nutrients like carbon or nitrogen. So if you look at the red arrows, energy comes from the sunlight into these plants, photosynthetic organisms. Now they convert some of that energy to chemical energy. They store it as sugar. They're not doing that to be nice to everybody else. They're doing that for their own selfish purposes. They're using that sugar to make ATP to fuel all their metabolic demands. And as they're undergoing metabolism, cellular respiration that you guys learned about in some biology course, one of the waste products of cellular respiration is heat. It's an inefficient metabolic process. So there's heat that's produced. Now you see that red arrow coming up from the producers, from those plants, in the form of heat. So that is energy that's lost. It goes up into the air, up into space, into the universe. That energy that came from the sun is lost. It's lost forever. And then these plants are fed upon by consumers. These consumers use the energy that they eat. We would be in the same category as these ants that have this leaf there. We consume food, we burn that fuel in our cells, and we use the energy that's in that food to make ATP. And then we use ATP to power all the different reactions and work that's done inside of our cells. Making ATP is an inefficient process, and there's a lot of heat that's lost. Now we, as warm-bodied organisms, we have mechanisms for conserving some of that heat, and we use that to heat our bodies, this metabolic heat. That's why we have a constant temperature, body temperature. We retain that metabolic heat, but ultimately it's lost to the air, to the water, wherever we are. It's lost to the universe as well. Now, some of that organic matter, if we died, if those ants died, they would fall to the ground and they would be decomposed. So now there's energy in these red arrows from the plants and from the ants, from the us that are dead. That energy is available for decomposers. Other things aren't necessarily using that energy in plants or energy in ants until they die. So the decomposers, they get energy from producers and consumers both. Now they have their own metabolic demands. That's their source of energy. They're undergoing cellular respiration. They're making ATP. And that's an inefficient process. And energy is lost as heat. And it's never returned. It doesn't cycle back. It's lost forever. So you see those energy arrows. They come into living things and then they leave. They go out into the universe and they're lost. It doesn't cycle back around. Now if you look at those blue arrows, if a consumer eats a plant, it's getting carbon, it's getting nitrogen. That plant it dies, that animal dies, that consumer dies. Now these decomposers, those mushrooms or bacteria, fungi, whatever it is, they're doing the decomposing. those obtain nutrients like phosphate and nitrogen from producers and consumers. And then those decomposers, they die. They're associated with the roots of plants. They're in the soil. And so the blue arrows you see, they cycle back to producers. There's nitrogen and phosphate and carbon that can be reincorporated into plants. So the nutrients, we'll see that they're really cycles. They cycle around. That's what carbon does. That's what phosphate does. If you're looking at something else that's not organic, then water does the same kind of thing. Some of these are, you could stick another square in there, a rectangle, and have the rocks, for instance, or the air or water. So in terms of nutrients, we're going to see this cycling. Around and around it goes. In terms of energy, it's a one-way direction. So that's kind of a long explanation, but it's a fundamental difference between energy and nutrients. However, they're both moving through different organisms in ecosystems. Now, this is what I was talking about before, that the first law of thermodynamics states that energy is neither created or destroyed. It just changes forms. And so there's light energy from the sun. That type of energy is photons. And then that energy is transferred to electrons in photosynthetic organisms. So photons is one form. Then there's energy in electrons. That energy in electrons is ultimately transferred to energy in sugar. And even before that, it's transferred to energy in ATP to join carbons together to make that sugar. And then that sugar is broken down when plants are eaten and used to make ATP. So there's a number of different forms of energy. It's all energy. It's one form or the other. You can measure it different ways. There's different units of that energy. But one way or the other, energy is not created. It's not destroyed. Energy arrives from the sun. It's just transferred from one form to another. And then when it's passed through these living things, it's lost its heat, it's lost its heat, it's lost its heat. It's lost forever. So some energy from the sun is converted into sugar. Some energy in sugar in plants is converted to ATP. It's converted to muscle or some kind of tissue in an animal. But a lot of that energy is lost from one step to another. From a plant to a consumer, most of the energy is actually lost as heat. That's what we're going to see when we start looking at how efficient this transfer of energy from one organism to another is. It's really not very efficient. So what we're going to do is look at energy moving through individual organisms. You eat something and you've got energy in your body, and that energy is distributed in organisms different ways, but it's relatively consistent what organisms use this energy for. And then we're going to look at energy flow through communities, and then we're going to look at energy flow through ecosystems. So that's going to be our approach. Let's start looking at individual organisms. And as I said, you eat something. We can all think about this ourselves. You consume a meal. In that meal, there's a certain amount of energy. We measure that energy as calories. You can measure that energy as joules as well. That's the international units for work. So you eat something, you have a meal, you eat something during the day, breakfast, lunch, dinner, some snack or something. Roughly, you probably have an idea of how many calories you are consuming in a day. Maybe between 2,000 or 3,000, depending on whether you're a man or a woman or how big you are, those kind of things, how much you eat, obviously. But you get a certain amount of energy that you consume. And you can follow the path of that energy as it's distributed to different demands in your body. If you kept track of where that energy went, you could make an energy budget. Just like you're making a budget for your expenses. You have a certain amount of income. Some of that goes towards rent. Some of it goes towards electricity, phone, the internet, gas, food, whatever you're spending your income on. There's main components that make up a budget. For an energy budget, it's similar and it's consistent amongst organisms in terms of what do you eat all this energy as a living thing? What is that energy used for? So the amount of energy that you consume, you could look at that as consumption, or you could look at that as ingestion. That's I in this equation. Some of that energy, it passes through your digestive system. It's not even absorbed into your body. It just passes through your digestive system and it's lost as feces. Now, our digestive systems are pretty good at absorbing energy and assimilating it into our bodies. Different organisms, like herbivores, have a lot harder time extracting energy. So it depends on what you're eating. It depends on your digestive system. It depends on the enzymes that you have, how efficient your body is. But there's a certain amount of energy that's consumed that isn't available to the organism, and it's lost as feces. So that's F, egestion. There's also a certain amount of energy that's incorporated into your body. It's taken out of your digestive tract, into your bloodstream, circulated around your body, and it's lost in your excretory system as nitrogen. Now that energy is not available to the organism, but it's processed by the organism. It's lost not in the feces in the digestive system, but it's lost in the excretory system, and that is energy that's lost as urine. If you're a fish, they're also excreting ammonia from their gills. Different organisms excrete nitrogenous wastes from places other than their excretory system, but that is basically energy that's lost in urine. So if you look at that equation down there, there's energy that you consume or ingestion. Some of it's lost in the feces and some of it's lost in the urine. So what you have left, which is actually the majority of energy that you eat, can be channeled towards two different things. And we've looked at these in the past in this class. We've emphasized the importance of these. One is respiration. Now, respiration is another word for metabolism. If you channel this energy towards moving things, moving your body, your muscles contracting, transporting substances across the cell membrane, powering nerve transmissions, those kind of things, there's all these different requirements in our bodies and our cells that use energy. That energy is ATP. So you use ATP, and in animals, anyway, along with that ATP use is oxygen use. And so you may not be familiar with ATP and associate that with respiration. It's a form of cellular respiration, certainly. But oxygen consumption, how everybody associates that with respiration. You breathe in oxygen, you breathe out carbon dioxide. That's what we think of as respiration. So when you breathe in an oxygen and using it to break down food and make ATP, that's respiration. So it's basically metabolism. That is what most energy goes towards, that we eat. It makes sense. Your highest amount of energy use is for metabolism, just living and carrying out the different processes in your cells. What's left over, though, you can put towards two things that you could call production. which are growth and reproduction. If you have extra energy, you've lost some in the feces, you've lost some in the urine, you've spent what you need to be able to maintain your body. What you have left over, you can channel towards growth, which you're doing a lot of when you're young. You guys are not growing anymore, so that's what you've been doing your whole life. You're not doing it anymore. All you're doing from now on is trying not to die, trying to maintain your bodies, and then you're going to be doing some reproducing. You're going to have some extra energy to channel towards reproduction. Now that, we looked at the importance of reproduction in terms of genetic immortality, evolutionary success. So you can apply the first law of thermodynamics, this conservation of energy, to what energy does when it flows through an individual organism. There's a certain amount of energy that's ingested. Let's look at this in a frog. There's a frog that's eaten another frog, so it's gotten some energy in a meal, a certain number of calories. Then it's using that energy to power its metabolic demands. It breathes out carbon dioxide, which represents, you could measure carbon dioxide, or you could measure oxygen consumption, or you could measure ATP use. That's energy towards metabolism, or that's the R that's leaving the mouth of this frog. Then you've got the P, production, which is growth and reproduction. A certain amount of energy is channeled towards the growth of that frog. And of course, when they're younger, they're doing a lot of growing. When they get bigger, older, they don't grow as much, but they start reproducing. Energy that's available for reproduction. And then this frog is losing some energy in the feces and urine. You could take a wolf or a bobcat or a human, any of us, and replace that frog with us, and that's what we'd see in terms of the use of this energy. So there's different ways that you can quantify the efficiency of energy flow in organisms. As I said, different organisms have they consume different things that are broken down to different levels. Different organisms have different enzymes. They have different digestive systems. So there's different levels of efficiency with which organisms extract energy from their food, basically. So we'll look at a couple of these different indices that will indicate how efficient an organism is at extracting energy and channeling that energy towards something important for that animal, which is growth and reproduction, or the P in that equation. So you consume a certain amount of energy. Some of it's lost in your digestive tract. It's never absorbed. So if you look at the ingested energy, let's say you consumed 1,000 calories and you lost 100 calories in your feces, then that's 90% efficient. So you have absorbed a certain amount of energy. You've lost a little bit of energy. Now you've got 900 calories that you absorbed out of your food into your body, and let's say 800 of those 900 calories you're actually using for metabolism, or you're using for growth or reproduction, but the rest of it is lost. The rest of it is unavailable to you. So it's a little bit. It's not as much as lost in the feces, but some of it is lost in the urine. And so this energy that you ingested, not all of it is available for reproduction or growth or metabolism. Some of it's lost. Now that's the energy that's assimilated. The energy that's not lost in the urine or the gill effluent is energy that's assimilated. It's different than energy that's absorbed. And now, of that assimilated energy, most of those 800 calories are going to be used for metabolism. Let's say you use 700 calories for your metabolism. You have a metabolic rate that supports your level of activity, all the different processes that are taking place in your body. So that represents production, the amount of energy that goes towards growth or reproduction. That's production. So you can express these different levels, different abilities of extracting energy and depositing energy in these different forms as efficiencies. As I said, if you're eating plants, you're going to have a different efficiency than if you're eating meat, animals, if you're a carnivore. So let's look at a couple of these things. One is assimilation efficiency. Now again, you consume a certain amount of energy. You take a meal, it's got a certain number of calories. Some of that is going to be lost in the feces. Digestive system of carnivores usually pretty high. So if you look at these, how much energy is lost in the feces, for instance, for somebody like humans or animals that are carnivores for the most part, then it would be 80 or 90% of energy is taken out of our food and into our bloodstream, and only about 20% is lost. For some animals, it's 90% efficient, even higher than that sometimes. So our digestive systems and the digestive systems of most carnivores or omnivores is relatively high. Now, if you eat a lot of seeds, if you eat a lot of vegetation, a lot of grass with a lot of cellulose that's hard to digest, then you lose a lot of energy in your feces. The urine, it's not so much. So usually maybe 7% of what you eat. But if you combine those, if you see how much energy that you ate made it out of your digestive system, into your blood, into your cells, then it would be what is available for deposition as growth or producing products of reproduction. So if you subtracted the amount of energy that you consumed, and if you subtracted the amount that you lost in the feces and urine, what's left over is basically what is available for those other things. And you divided that by the amount of calories that were ingested or consumed, and multiply that by 100, that would give you an efficiency, an assimilation efficiency. So you can look at different types of organisms and you can see what kind of assimilation efficiencies are characteristic of those organisms. Another way of looking at this is the production efficiency. One thing that we've looked at during the semester is this idea of genetic immortality. Certainly you've heard that a number of times during the semester, and you're familiar with that idea that the goal of living things is to reproduce and pass your genes on to the next generation, and we consider that success. So production, this taking energy that you've consumed and channeling it either towards growth or towards reproduction, that is what is going to determine really how successful you are from an evolutionary point of view. Of course, if you're channeling energy and using it for metabolism, then that's important for survival, and that's important for being able to reproduce. It's important for not dying, but it's not what you're measuring in terms of your genetic contribution to the next generation. This growth is important for not getting eaten, for surviving, and then included in this growth, not in these equations, but included in growth or production, basically, it's not just growth, but it's also reproduction. So in studies where they measure this production efficiency in animals, they typically use immature animals, so they don't have to deal with the extra component of reproduction. But it's not just energy that's available towards growth, especially when you reach maturity. There's some animals that have indeterminate growth, so they keep growing, but that growth rate slows down quite a bit as they get bigger, and they're channeling this extra energy towards reproduction instead of growth. There's other animals like us, birds, that reach a certain size and they stop growing. Now that energy is not going towards growth, but it's going towards reproduction. Either way, though, how much energy that you consume is not used for metabolism, not lost in the feces, not lost in the urine, but is available. It's deposited as tissue, it's deposited as gametes, part of the reproductive organs, testes, ovaries, part of the plant. How much of that energy winds up as growth, as tissue that's deposited, or as sperm or eggs or part of the ovary or testes? If you express that as a percentage of what you ingested, then you have an idea of production efficiency. And you can look at this two different ways. One is more detailed than the other one, but if you look at gross production efficiency, that's where you just how much of the energy that you ingested goes towards production, multiplied by 100. For birds and mammals, it's usually not very high. They have a high metabolic rate. They're warm-bodied, use a lot of energy to heat their bodies, so it's pretty low. For aquatic animals, it's a lot higher. And another way of looking at this efficiency that takes into consideration their digestive system, how well their digestive system works in assimilating food, their excretory system, is looking at this not as gross production efficiency, but as net production efficiency. So now it's not just production divided by energy that's ingested, but it's production divided by energy lost in the urine, lost in the feces, and that is subtracted from ingestion. So this is going to be higher, this net production efficiency, because you're not just considering energy that's ingested, you're subtracting energy that's not even available to be channeled towards growth or reproduction, because energy that's lost in the feces and urine, it either doesn't make its way into the body of the organism in terms of energy loss in feces, or if it does make its way into the blood, it's not available for those things because it's lost in the urine. So how much of the energy that's available for either metabolism or reproduction or growth makes its way towards reproduction or growth? That's what net production efficiency is. So in birds, it's still pretty low. The high metabolic rate, they're not able to channel that much energy towards reproduction or growth. They have determinate growth, so once they reach a certain size, they stop growing. So look at these net production efficiencies. You can see that how much energy is used for metabolism in birds and mammals compared to things that don't have such a high metabolic rate. They can reproduce more. They can channel less energy towards supporting their metabolic rate. So this is how energy flows through individual organisms. There's energy comes in, and it's used in a very consistent way in a lizard, in a frog, in a human, in terms of some of it lost in egestion or the feces, some of it lost in excretion, the urine or the gill effluent in the case of fish or invertebrates, aquatic organisms that have gills. Most of it is used for respiration. That's why we eat things in the first place, is to power our bodies. And what's left over, we have in excess, can be channeled towards growth, which is important for survival, getting to the point where you're going to start reproducing, not dying, basically. And part of that production is reproduction, making eggs, making gametes, expending the amount of energy that it takes to reproduce and be evolutionarily successful and to obtain genetic immortality. It's very interesting, this flow of energy through individual organisms, and it's really, really important how animals and plants, other things, channel energy towards surviving and reproducing. Now, the more stressful an environment is, the more energy is channeled towards metabolism. Just to be able to survive, you've got to do extra things, and the less energy that you have for production. That's why if you live in a stressful environment, it's really salty, it's really cold, it's really hot, whatever, all of that takes extra energy, which means less energy for production, growth, or reproduction, which means a lower level of evolutionary success. So this flow of energy through individual organisms says a huge amount about the evolutionary fitness of different organisms, their ability to obtain genetic immortality. Another way of looking at this is looking at plants. So you can look at this last slide about plants, and plants have their own metabolic demands, not nearly as high. Their metabolic rate isn't anything like animals, but they've got to channel some energy towards their own energy demands. And what's left over is really important for things that eat plants, because what's left over is what's in a leaf, or what's in a fruit, what's in a plant that something eats. So if you look at these different plants in the temperate zones, their production efficiencies, in the tropics, their production efficiencies are affected by how much energy they're using to meet their own metabolic demands and that they're using for themselves. So it's not just animals, but it's plants that are influenced by this as well. So you can look at what's in this slide, but we're going to move on to looking at energy flow through communities and then through ecosystems as well. This is a much longer lecture than we typically have, breaking these into two. So the next lecture will be much shorter.